For those of you who are joining us new, I'm Nathan Benaich, and I'm an investor at Air Street Capital, and my partner on this is Alex Flamant, who's an investor at Singular. We're both venture capitalists and active readers and followers of machine learning. And we run this group as a community for AI practitioners from lots of different spaces in the ecosystem, from big tech companies to startups and academia. Really is a place that we can meet and convene and learn from one another and really get a sense of where the buck is going from those who are actually developing the technology or working on it. And so we've got lots of different companies that are in the room. They sort of represent a huge gamut of different products and markets and industries. And we think this is a really special kind of ecosystem in which to talk about some of the most pressing topics in machine learning. And today we're really excited to have Cade Metz join us here. He is probably one of the, I guess, best known, and personally, I think he's the best reporter in machine learning. He's a technology correspondent at the New York Times. Has been spending quite a number of years now with his ear to the ground and in a lot of back rooms that we probably don't get access to, really understanding what's happening in machine learning, the key players in the field and what they're doing and their personalities and what makes them tick. And really kind of charting an amazing kind of end-to-end 60-year history of what happened in deep learning and where things might be going. So we'll be running a fireside conversation for about 20-25 minutes with some questions that I think will give you a flavor of the book and kind of unveil some of its secrets that I hope you'll want to dive into. And then in the next 20 or so minutes, we'll field questions that you've pre-submitted in your registration that I hope will be really interesting as well. All these events, as you know, are run as a nonprofit through the RAAIS Foundation, where we really try and further education and research for AI in the common good by supporting open source projects. And you can keep in touch with us and all the events that we'll do in the future through our newsletter, through Facebook, Twitter, and then sometimes on Clubhouse for fun. So with that, I'd like to welcome Cade Metz, who I introduced very briefly. So we'll do a little quick kind of fireside chat to give you a sense of where the book is coming from. We have it right here. I was very thankful to Cade for giving me an early copy. It's out today on Amazon in the UK. So to kick things off, I thought we would kind of dive into understanding your motivations and what you were trying to kind of deliver to readers by writing this book, and maybe what is the thing or what is the most important thing that you hope people will take away from it when they do read it?
Well, you know, I think the irony here is that it's a book about artificial intelligence, but it's such a human story. And that's what I wanted to do. Like, I wanted to do a human story on multiple levels. I wanted to show how this technology is really changing our lives and help people really understand, you know, what is working and what is not and where it's going. But the best way to tell any story is through people. And I became fascinated as I reported on this stuff over the years by the people who were building it and people who had spent decades struggling to build the technologies we're going to talk about here. And they're such fascinating people in each in their own way. And the reason I'm glad to do this talk is that, you know, two of the central characters are British. And that's the role of the UK in this is really important and really interesting. And in fact, you know, I have an audio version of the book, which is also out today. And it's narrated by a British actor because of that, right? There's a real awesome British flavor to this. And I want that to come through. Part of it is, you know, the sense of humor of the central character, Geoffrey Hinton, who was born in London. It is a tremendous sense of humor that he brings to the book. And it's a very British sense of humor. And I'm happy to get that into my piece.
Yeah, totally. They're replying to emails as I prefer Jeffrey, signed Jeff.
Exactly. That sums that guy up, I'll tell you.
Yeah. So maybe on the topic of Hinton, you kind of start the story off with a pretty big bang that I think not many people are sort of aware of, and this is his company DNN Research. Do you want to maybe tell people very briefly like what the opening is and this acquisition story, and what I was interested in is you sort of hint as you go through it that the world could look very different if the outcome of the buyer would have been quite different given who was around the table.
It's really true. Sometimes when you're writing a story at the New York Times, or if you're writing a book, certainly it's hard to decide where to begin, right? But with this book, it was the opposite. Like, it had to begin with this incredible story. As I was reporting the story, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like, I spent years reporting this and making sure every fact was right, and yet a part of me, still wonders if I should believe it. It's like too perfect. But it's amazing. It's this moment where this one idea, the idea of a neural network, which dates back to the 50s, started to work, right? And the industry, the tech industry, realized it was starting to work. And what's fascinating is how quickly the industry jumped on it. And it's equally fascinating how Jeff took advantage of that, right? So he and his two students at the University of Toronto, they published this paper that shows that a neural network can recognize objects and images with an accuracy that no other technology had ever achieved. And that's important for the future, right? For facial recognition, for driverless cars, for all sorts of other robotics and all sorts of other technologies, right? It worked in other areas, and he knew it would continue to work in other areas. And he decides to auction his services off to the highest bidder. He literally had some of the biggest companies involved in this bidding for his services. And one of the fascinating things, and this is what you were alluding to, is that one of those companies was a Chinese company, Baidu. And sometimes in this field, people think about China as a big player, but that they trailed in this respect, right? And they were kind of late to the game, but they were there from the beginning. And that is what is so fascinating. And a British company, by the way, was there at the beginning. And that was another amazing moment for me, is when Demis Hassabis, the founder of DeepMind in London, told me, I was at their offices in London. He says, "Oh, by the way, we were one of the bidders." At that point, even the other people in the auction didn't know who that fourth bidder was. And then he tells me, and that's fascinating too, that Demis and DeepMind saw what was happening as well, and were acquiring all the talent in this area, and that they wanted more, and that's why they started bidding for Jeff as well.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think having listened and tried to study the story of DeepMind a lot, like one of the things that Demis talks as, or refers to as, a competitive advantage is the cross-disciplinary nature of their approach to AI. And there was this awesome quote that I wasn't aware of that you wrote about, which is from Alan Eustace. I think at the time was a SVP at Google, and also casually the world record holder for the highest altitude free fall jump. Which I didn't know either. And he said, quote, "Most people look at particular problems from a particular point of view and have a particular perspective and a particular history. They don't look at the intersections of expertise that will change the picture." I thought that was really telling in the context of DeepMind. And I was curious if you had a view, having studied all these different organizations, what kinds of new intersections maybe are required as we look forward, perhaps to the next iteration of deep learning, or what might come afterwards?
Yes, yeah, I think this is a really key point. And you see this not only in the way these companies react to this, right? And Google in particular, and Eustace is one of the people inside Google who thinks this way, that you have to kind of look outside your point of view and be willing to take in these other points of view. And the whole story is like that. Like, Jeff Hinton embraced that idea of a neural network in the early 70s when no one believed in it. Like, even people in the AI field didn't believe in it, right? He's looking outside the common point of view. And he's willing to say that I can see where this is going, even when everyone else is saying it's not. And that's a common theme. And you're right, it's so important to any business. And it's important to Google, certainly, but also what's fascinating is that even though Alan Eustace, voices that, he explains that idea, even inside Google, people are struggling to embrace that, right?
Yeah.
And people see this technology working, and they see that the way to get it to work is these new types of computer chips, right? That the neural network starts to work because of these processors that were actually built for games. And even though Jeff Hinton on the one hand is showing that this is the way forward, there are people at Google who are saying, wait, we're going to put a bunch of gaming chips in our data center. We're not going to do that, right? So it's hard even for these companies that are geared towards that idea for them to move in those directions.
And just jumping on a quick point. So you were bringing up Canada, University of Toronto, SciFar, University of Montreal by extension. I think that's where we used to see some of the gray matter and efforts being pushed in the field, and now there's definitely a GAFA brain drain happening. Even thinking back to Carnegie Mellon and Uber a few years ago. How do you see the core of research progressing in the next few years? Do you think there's a hope for academia to retake the torch, or do you think the future of cutting edge machine learning is going to be staying with GAFAs for the next few years?
I think it's definitely going to be staying in industry for the next few years. That's a real concern for a lot of people, right? It's just economics, right? You see in the opening of the book, Jeff sells his services and the services to students for millions of dollars, right? And that set the price for the talent. And you see over the years, this talent being able to command lots of money, for one thing. But the other thing is, these companies are where the other two things that you need reside, right? You need data, lots and lots of data, and you need lots and lots of computing power, right? And that's where all those forces are, right? It's where the money is, the data, and the computing power. So naturally, there's gonna be an imbalance there for the foreseeable future. And the academic question, it's not just academia, it's government labs, right? That's the other big concern, is that the talent is not in the government labs either. It's all in these very large companies. A lot of people are working to change that, and these things do even out over time, but it's really extreme at this particular moment.
One thing go for it.
I was going to say, one thing maybe to build on this that's quite astounding is today we think computing is taken for granted, is obvious that is required for progress in machine learning. And then the second point is that it's academia that told industry that this is the way the technology ecosystem is going to go. It wasn't the other way around. And there was an amazing little segment that you had when you talked about kind of the Google versus Microsoft kind of bake-off, as it were, where Hinton kind of goes for the first summer to Microsoft to work on speech and show that deep learning can work not just for images, but also for speech. So he does this stint at Microsoft Research with this guy Li Deng, who's now quite senior in the organization, who worked on speech. And he goes, quote, Hinton and his students explained that the project wouldn't succeed without a very different breed of hardware, including a $100,000 GPU card. And at first, Deng balked at the price. His boss, Alex Flamant, who would one day oversee Siri at Apple, told him this was an unnecessary expense. GPUs were for gamers, as you said, not AI research. And he said, quote, don't waste your money, telling Deng to skip the expensive NVIDIA gear and buy generic cards from a local Fry's electronics store. Which is just amazing.
It does encapsulate that attitude. And it shows you these forces that all these people are working against. But I think you've made another key point, is that it's the academics that realize where this is going, and they end up influencing these companies in enormous ways. And one way we haven't talked about is that they sort of force these companies to publish all their research, and that's still the way it works, is that the new results get openly published. That didn't necessarily happen before. And it's fascinating to me how all the new ideas are suddenly available from day one to everyone on Earth, right? That has big geopolitical ramifications.
We see it with companies like Apple, right, who were the last ones to get on the game, and as a result, at least they're doing amazing things, but maybe not one of the top companies I would cite in terms of having pushed the envelope over the past few years. But so just as given Nathan and I look at more early stage machine learning stories, is there hope for early early stage startups to take on the GAFAs, or is the natural step just acquisition? How can they rival titans that have the data and the computing power and the budget to out-hire their staff?
Yeah, it is really hard. I think you're going to see a gap when it comes to certain technologies. Like right now, one of the big technologies in the field are these really, really big neural networks that learn the nuances of language. They call them universal language models. And the big example now is GPT-3 out of OpenAI, the lab in San Francisco. And they're backed by Microsoft to the tune of $1 billion. And that $1 billion goes into that computing power. And those types of models, which train on just like enormous swaths of the internet over months inside a data center, that's going to be the domain of the big guys for a while. Now, computing power gets cheaper, and these things sometimes get open sourced, and that might trickle down. But there are other areas where startups can really succeed. You know, I just did a piece about a whole series of startups that are taking these ideas and applying them to self-flying drones, right? And you know, I looked at Endural and Skydio in Silicon Valley. There are other companies in Southern California, even in Utah, you know, which are taking these ideas and applying them to that type of robotics, and that has all sorts of applications in the military, outside the military, for reconnaissance, as you know, as well as on the battlefield. And it's really startups that are doing that. So there are areas where smaller companies can compete.
And maybe on the subject of large kind of AI labs, you mentioned OpenAI. I think the other thing that I learned through the book, which was interesting, were these character developments and character studies that you did with, you know, LeCun, Hinton, Hassabis, Sutskever. Like in one segment, you said, where you quoted Hinton saying, you know, only Demis could have ran AlphaGo, and he did it like Oppenheimer ran the Manhattan Project. And if anybody else would have run it, it wouldn't have gone nearly as well and nearly as fast, which I think is extremely telling also in the context of startups where the management team is key to execution. But then on the other side, like for another personality, you see, you know, Musk and Altman, who painted OpenAI as the counterweight to what they call the dangers presented by the big internet companies. What's kind of ironic at the time is like they argue that the threat of malicious AI would be mitigated precisely because their technology would be available to everybody and not biased by a corporate kind of backer. Now, all those things have sort of changed as the kind of ecosystem has changed as well. But I was curious whether, like, you know, your understanding of these characters and their personalities might kind of give us a sense over like how these labs will evolve, and maybe, you know, will we still see this kind of bimodal world of OpenAI versus DeepMind, or will we see additional labs as maybe, you know, politics comes into play and people want to do things differently?
It's really interesting, and I love that you focus on the personalities. I mean, let's start with the personalities, then we'll move into the labs. Like, you know, one of the reasons that Jeff Hinton talks about Demis as an Oppenheimer figure, it's not, you know, it's for two reasons. Demis is a scientist, right? And what Jeff is saying is that Demis really, really understands the science. At the same time, he has this extreme power to motivate people, right? He has extreme ambition himself. And I've talked to so many of his employees about this over the years, that like he just has this power to motivate people and get them to push as hard as he is towards these big goals. So it's sort of the combination of the two. You know, Musk and Altman are different figures. They're not the scientists that Demis is, but they have similar ambition, right? And they do really want to push this stuff forward, and they have a real talent for raising money, for instance. And it's really the money that is needed to push this research in extreme directions for the moment. So that's why I think that, you know, when it comes to those really, really ambitious projects, those are going to be the two labs for the moment, as well as those really big companies.
Yeah. Maybe this is another kind of transition, which is, you know, China and geopolitics. So we're kind of talking about the Western labs, but kind of ignoring perhaps what's happening in China, which you do dive into in the book. And one of the segments I thought was also quite telling was this kind of segment around the AlphaGo match, where Google executives fly over, or Alphabet executives fly over to Asia, and Eric Schmidt is on stage at this conference in Wuzhen, and he says all major Chinese internet companies would be better off if they used TensorFlow. It almost sounds like kind of Western proselytizing, especially given that you're right. What he didn't realize was that China's tech giants had been doing this like all along, basically. And Andrew Ng was already building Baidu AI for many years. And in any case, even if it did need Google's help, like China wouldn't take it on because the government had blacked out the AlphaGo match in Wuzhen. And later on, you say that Schmidt revised the statement saying, quote, I knew when I gave the speech that the Chinese were coming. I just didn't understand at the time how totally effective some of their programs would be. I honestly just didn't understand. I think most Americans wouldn't understand, and I'm not going to misunderstand in the future. And then what's amazing is, a few years later, like 2 weeks ago, basically, like Eric Schmidt is pushing this national security report and huge investment in AI. And so I'm really interested to get your take on, what happened here. Like, did he, what was he thinking? And perhaps what is your take on his newest, policy recommendations?
Again, I love that you bring this up. I was there in China when that happened. It was shocking, right? I'd actually been in Korea the year before when DeepMind and Google brought this Go plane machine to Seoul, and it was an unbelievable moment. Like, you could feel the whole country, all of Korea sort of swaying to and fro as this match between a machine and a human swayed to and fro. And it was a huge PR opportunity for Google, right? That was the moment when this field really showed itself to the general public. Like, people could understand a game, right? That a machine for the first time had beaten one of the best players at this very complex ancient game. And people really understood that. And, it was a great, moment for Google in terms of just promoting itself. And then they wanted to do the same thing in China, right? A year later, they talked about this at the top of the company, right? This is another PR opportunity. We want to get back into China, which is, in hindsight, what an idea that is. Like, they're going to get back into China. I mean, good luck. But that's the way they saw it. We're going to go back to China. It's going to be another big PR opportunity. And there were two amazing moments there, and you alluded to them. One is that I get there, and there are plans to broadcast this new match between AlphaGo, the machine built by DeepMind, and the best Go player in the world at the time, the 19-year-old Cade, who's Chinese himself. It's going to be broadcast across China. 60 million Chinese had watched the match in Korea, and they're going to broadcast it on state TV, as well as across the internet. And right before the match happens, an order came down from the government and shut down the TV plans. And there was an order to Chinese journalists, and I talked to journalists who were there, that said, if you write about this, you cannot use the word Google, right? So the curtain came down on this. And I'm inside this arena with just a few other journalists and dignitaries. And it was this weird feeling that you're the only ones in the country seeing this, and for everyone else, it's not happening, right?
That's crazy.
And then Eric Schmidt gets up on stage, and I couldn't believe what he was saying, because, having known the history. And, and at that point, I didn't know, Chinese politics as well as I do now. And I certainly still don't know it as well as some of my colleagues who live over there and cover this on a daily basis. But it was shocking that he was saying this. It was almost like he was talking down to the country, right? What you guys need to do is you just need to embrace, what Google's doing. Well, it hasn't exactly worked out that way, right? And you're right. He's on this commission that's just delivered a new report to Congress and the president, talking about how the U.S. needs to think differently about this and better blend industry and government. And they even want to create like a national school for AI researchers, essentially like a West Point for digital services, they call it. So he really sees the gap there between the way that the Chinese are doing things and maybe the way the U.S. is.
Yeah. I think we had a question maybe on this topic, which is like, where do you see Europe's role? Like, do you think that Europe has a shot, and in particular the UK? Like, where do we fit into this ecosystem, and sort of quote, like, how can we generate more genius makers? Like, what do we need to do?
Well, it's really interesting. There's a story I wrote about this a couple of years ago in the Times. I visited when I was in DeepMind. That time I talked to Demis. I also spent a lot of time in Cambridge.
Yep.
And it was fascinating to me. I hadn't been in Cambridge for a while. And I got off the train and I walked towards the university. And you walk 2 blocks and there's this giant Microsoft research lab. And then you walk a couple more and then there's the Apple lab. And they'd acquired this company that was there. And there's all these foreign tech giants. There was this big building that was being built. Turns out it was a Samsung lab. So you don't have that UK tech giant. Like a lot of people say, DeepMind could have been that. But you do have a lot of talent in the area, right? And you do have people of major influence. You just don't have that tech giant yet, and that that may or may not happen. But the talent there is enormous, not just in Cambridge, but you go to London, and that's another key area. And that that it's usually around the universities, right? And that's a big part of this book, is how all that talent sort of bubbles up in the UK as well as other parts of the world.
And one point which obviously Nathan's written quite a bit about, but it's just commercializing that talent. So I think same in Paris or in Germany, we'll find this, or ETH in Zurich, really great at churning out gray matter. Some of it will go and build interesting applications, but then those that actually manage to build massive companies is quite rare. Any thoughts as to why Europe might struggle in that field compared to the States, without getting too political?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically about the fact that like all those other giants are already there, right? And they control the infrastructure, right? So it worked out that you had basically these 5 American companies that grew up and controlled the infrastructure. That's a key part of this technology, as we talked about, is the data centers and the data needed to build this stuff. So they're kind of in place. You're not going to compete with that, right? It's impossible. And your DeepMind sort of shows this, that they had all the talent, they knew where things were going, they had everything in place, but then these companies start throwing all this money at it, and they knew they couldn't compete with that, right? They've said this to me, both 2 of the founders, that they sort of had to sell at that moment, because otherwise their talent would just be poached by these very large companies, right? So we're just at this moment where until there's a new infrastructure, right, and until the dynamic really changes, you can't compete with Google and Microsoft and Facebook.
I mean, maybe one area of competition that we could talk about, or evolving area of competition, is in the sciences. And you have a little segment of this in the book as well, where you talk about an episode with George Dahl, who's well-acclaimed at that time PhD student of Hinton, who just casually in his spare time entered a Kaggle competition, which was hosted by Merck, the big pharmaceutical company. And the task was to explore drug discovery, particular a technique called quantitative structure-activity relationship. I think basically how drugs kind of bind to proteins or targets. And then the quote is, George wiped out the entire field without even knowing its name. Like, I think it took him a weekend or something like that to hack together a neural network and then obliterate all the competition, and he didn't really even understand the problem he was solving. And it shows you kind of like the power and expressivity of deep learning and how it can be applied to lots of things. I mean, I've certainly been paying a lot of attention to AI in biology, but there's so many applications in the sciences that clearly, Demis and DeepMind care about. So I'd be curious to kind of get your take on where you think those kinds of opportunities might be, and to what degree science in general is sort of like the next frontier for machine learning in industry.
Yeah, I love that moment with George for 2 reasons. I mean, one, it does show the power of the individual, right? And we've talked about startups and small teams, and sometimes it's just individual people. They can find these places where if the technology is applied in the right way and the new technology is applied in the right way, they can beat all these established players, right? George is competing with, it's like dozens and dozens of companies and labs across the world, and he's just like half-heartedly doing this. He's like on a train going to Portland, right? And and he's like 7th in the rankings, and Hinton says, well, you better win now. And he does. And what the echo of this recently is at DeepMind, right? They had this result in the fall called AlphaFold, right? Where they joined this competition. It's called the protein folding competition. And this is a biological sciences problem that scientists have struggled to crack for decades. And usually it's biological sciences labs and companies in that area. And then this machine learning company comes out of nowhere, and they essentially solve the problem. Not necessarily with processing power in this case, like that's part of it, but it was really about their approach, and the way that Dim has pushed his employees to solve this particular problem. And it's a problem with huge implications. Like, a lot of people think that this type of work can help us when the next pandemic comes, when it comes to creating medicines for a vaccine, or repurposing the medicines we already have for people who have the condition, right? It's a really key result. It might be the most important result of the past decade.
And you've touched on a point where on one side of the spectrum, you're bringing up really exciting uses for this technology, such as being able to find vaccines a bit faster. And then you bring out the battlefield applications. What are maybe some of the things us and our audience might have heard of, but what are some of the new fields that really excite you? And what are some of the ones you're a bit cautious, if not worried about?
What I think is interesting is how very often those two things are one and the same, right? Like, we talk about GPT-3, that those giant language models that learn from the internet. That has some really amazing applications potentially. Like, for more than half a century, computer scientists have dreamed of building a machine that can pass the Turing test, right? That can carry on a conversation. And that's what those technologies are helping us do, among other things, right? Is develop a machine that can do a turn-by-turn conversation, but they can also, these systems generate tweets and blog posts and news articles. And that can be used in so many ways, from the Google search engine to so many other services you're going to use on a daily basis. But it's also a way of generating disinformation, right? We have all these systems now that can generate disinformation on their own. And they're not perfect yet. But when they get to be perfect, I think we're going to have to think about the world differently, right? Once a machine can generate something, whether it's text or an image, that looks like the real thing, and we can't tell the difference, once it can do that, 10 times out of 10, then we're in trouble, I think, right? And we're not there yet, but that's a scary thought.
I mean, given that you write professionally for a living, what is the chasm between where the tech is now and where you need it to be for you to have this in a writing editor, so you can give it a few prompts and it can learn, Cade's style, and then generate content that at least can be pretty good, so you don't have to do everything? Perhaps even read the text for you in your audiobooks.
Right. So this is one thing I really struggle to explain to people. Like, for those who haven't used GPT-3, I think this is what they need to understand is, and I've used it. When I was writing a story about it, my editor, he wanted a speech in the voice of Donald Trump, right? And so you can get GPT to do this, and in ways that are just jaw-dropping. Like, you sort of spin the wheel and you get this speech that could have come out of Donald Trump's mouth, and it's perfectly punctuated, and it's strange in the way his speech might be strange, and funny in the way it might be funny, and it's really shocking. But if you spin the wheel 10 times, it doesn't happen every time. And you might get one that is absolutely perfect, but then the next one, it's awful. And the third one, you've got to tweak it to get it right. And so we're not quite there yet. And we're not sure that technology, as it stands today, will get there, right? It's all about how much data you have. It learns from so much text, and as you throw more at it, it gets better and better and better. But it's hard to tell if we're going to get to the point where it can weed out those problems.
Maybe some of us at some point in our lives are like thinking about writing a book or writing something, maybe not as expensive as this. I guess your first time book author, right?
Yeah.
Is there any kind of top tips that you learned, or, things that would make the process more efficient, or what makes an amazing story?
And for the rest of us, I think we'll limit it to how to improve our Medium posts, and we'll take
that. Well, what I really believe is, it is about, any good story is about people, and also, I write a lot about some very complicated technologies, and ultimately the trick is showing that through people, and sometimes it's the people who build it. And sometimes it's the effect that has on people. Like it's about the people who are using it. And if you can find those moments where the technology, intersects with those people, and they use it in ways that affects them, that's the way you get people to understand technology. And that's what I tried to do in this book, right? It's about, on the one hand, about Hinton and Benaich and so many other fascinating people and what they're going through as they're trying to build it. But then the second half of the book, it's about how this technology is affecting the world, right? And us as individuals, and the bias that gets baked into these systems and how that affects people, and the disinformation piece, and the big questions over autonomous weapons, right? These are all questions that affect us all. And when writing about technology, but also when you're writing about anything else, like, think about the people. That's what makes really good stories.
And we'll just, as we wrap up, just conscious of your time, but Cade, this is your first book. This is a field that's evolving very rapidly. Have you started thinking about the next book?
It's funny, I have, like, about 3 weeks ago, before the book even came out, my editor and I had a conversation about a new idea. I cannot tell you about it, but I'm already thinking in that direction. It's been a great experience to write the book, in part because you get to know all these people, right? And it's a satisfying thing. It's like when you're building technology, right? You are in a creative field, and this, like mine, my field is a creative field, and creating something and getting out into the world, that's a great thing, and I'd love to do it again.